What happens when one of Hollywood's calmest and most respected stars walks onto the most unpredictable stage on daytime television and refuses to back down when the tension turns personal? The audience inside the View thought they were about to watch another polished celebrity interview. Instead, they witnessed a moment so uncomfortable, so emotionally charged, that even the hosts seemed unsure how to recover from it. Before we dive into this explosive story, make sure you subscribe to the Echo View, hit that like button, and drop a comment below, because stories like this only get more intense. The studio lights burned bright across the stage that morning, reflecting off the glossy table where the hosts sat preparing for another high-profile interview. Producers moved quickly behind the cameras. Audience members whispered excitedly among themselves. There was already energy in the room before the show even started, because the guest wasn't just another actor promoting a movie. It was Chris Hemsworth. The moment his name was announced, applause exploded across the studio. Chris walked out with the kind of relaxed confidence that made him impossible to ignore. Tall, composed, smiling politely as he shook hands with every host on the panel. Even the camera operators seemed caught off guard by how effortlessly he controlled the room without even trying. Sunny Hostin smiled as she greeted him, though there was already a sharpness in her eyes that longtime viewers recognized immediately. Sunny had built a reputation for asking questions other hosts avoided. Sometimes audiences loved it. Sometimes celebrities clearly didn't. And today, something felt different from the start. Whoopi introduced Chris warmly. Joy cracked a joke about his accent, and the audience laughed as Chris leaned into the humor naturally. "I feel like Americans only understand me 50% of the time anyway," he joked. The crowd erupted again. For the first few minutes, everything felt smooth. Chris talked about his new film, his training schedule, balancing family life, and how exhausting worldwide press tours had become. But then Sunny shifted in her chair. The tone changed so subtly that most people didn't notice it at first. "So, Chris," she said carefully, folding her hands together, "a lot of people admire your image. Strong father, humble movie star, good husband. But some critics say Hollywood men are praised for doing the bare minimum while women are held to impossible standards." A few audience members murmured. Chris smiled politely. "Well," he answered calmly, "I think everyone's under pressure these days." Sunny tilted her head. "But don't you think men like you benefit from a system designed to protect male celebrities?" The air tightened instantly. Joy glanced sideways. Whoopi leaned back slightly. Chris kept his composure. "I think there are definitely unfair systems in Hollywood," he replied carefully. "But I also think people are individuals. I try to treat everyone respectfully." Sunny nodded slowly, but her expression didn't soften. "Respectfully," she continued. "That sounds like a very safe answer." The audience reacted with scattered laughter and tension at the same time. Chris chuckled lightly, though his eyes sharpened for the first time. "Well," he said, "safe answers usually happen when questions come with assumptions attached." The audience suddenly went quiet. You could feel the shift happen in real time. Sunny blinked. "What assumption am I making?" Chris leaned forward slightly, still smiling, but now there was steel underneath it. "That I somehow represent every problem in Hollywood because I'm a successful man." A few audience members clapped before quickly stopping themselves. Sunny's smile faded. "No one said that." "You implied it," Chris answered gently. "And I understand why these conversations matter. They should matter. But I think sometimes people walk into interviews already deciding who someone is before they speak." The room became uncomfortably still. Backstage producers immediately started exchanging nervous looks. This wasn't part of the usual rhythm anymore. Sunny crossed her arms. "So you think you're being unfairly targeted?" Chris shook his head immediately. "No, I think we're having a conversation. But conversations work better when both sides are listening instead of preparing their next attack." The audience reacted louder this time. A mix of applause, gasps, and shocked laughter rolled across the studio. Joy Behar's eyebrows lifted so high it almost looked theatrical. Whoopi stared down at her cards, hiding a smile. Sunny sat motionless for a second, and that second felt endless. Chris hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted her. But somehow, with one calm sentence, he'd completely shifted the balance of power at the table. Sunny tried regaining control quickly. "Well, nobody's attacking you, Chris." "I know," he replied softly. "But you asked why some celebrities give guarded answers. Sometimes it's because they feel conversations are becoming performances instead of discussions." Now the audience was fully invested. People leaned forward in their seats. Even camera operators seemed slower to move. Because suddenly this wasn't a celebrity interview anymore. It was two strong personalities quietly fighting for control without either one openly admitting it. Sunny gave a tight smile. Are you saying this show performs conversations? Chris paused. And that pause alone made the room nervous. I think modern media sometimes rewards conflict more than honesty, he finally answered. The crowd reacted instantly. Some applauded loudly. Others gasped. One woman near the front visibly covered her mouth. Sunny's expression hardened. That sounds like a criticism. Chris nodded calmly. It's an observation. The tension became unbearable. Whoopi finally stepped in carefully. Well, that's probably true everywhere now. The audience laughed nervously, grateful someone broke the pressure for even 2 seconds. But Sunny wasn't done. You've built a career partly through public image, she said. Magazine covers. Interviews. Public appearances. Isn't it convenient to criticize media while benefiting from it? Chris looked directly at her. And for the first time all interview, the smile disappeared completely. I'm grateful for my career, he said. But there's a difference between participating in media and rewarding negativity. Silence. Absolute silence. Even the audience stopped moving. Sunny opened her mouth, but Chris continued before she could interrupt. I've sat through interviews where people genuinely wanted conversation. And I've sat through others where it felt like someone needed a viral moment. The audience exploded. Gasps. Applause. One man literally stood up clapping before sitting back down awkwardly. Sunny looked stunned, because everyone understood exactly what he was implying. The producers backstage immediately started panicking. One assistant whispered urgently into a headset. Another pointed toward the stage with wide eyes. Social media producers were already typing furiously because clips from this interview were about to dominate the internet. Sunny tried smiling again, but now it looked forced. So now I'm chasing viral moments? Chris immediately shook his head. I didn't say that. But you implied it. The audience audibly reacted to her repeating his earlier line. Chris noticed it too. And suddenly he smiled again. Not arrogantly. Not cruelly. Just knowingly. That's fair, he admitted quietly. The crowd burst into laughter and applause. Even Joy couldn't stop herself from laughing openly now. Sunny looked around the table, realizing the audience was slipping away from her completely. And somehow that only made the atmosphere more dangerous. Because now this wasn't just about questions anymore. It was about pride. And everyone in the studio could feel it building towards something much bigger. The laughter from the audience should have eased the tension. Instead, it made everything worse. Because the moment Sunny Hostin realized the crowd was beginning to side with Chris Hemsworth, her entire posture changed. She straightened in her chair, folded her notes together more tightly, and the warmth that usually softened her delivery disappeared completely. The cameras kept rolling. Millions of viewers were watching live. And suddenly the atmosphere inside the View no longer felt like daytime television. It felt like a pressure cooker seconds from exploding. Well, Sunny said carefully, her voice sharper now, if you're suggesting journalists shouldn't ask difficult questions, that's a dangerous road. Chris stayed calm. I didn't say difficult questions were the problem. Then what is the problem? The intention behind them. The audience reacted instantly again. Not loudly this time. Just a low collective murmur spreading through the studio like people realizing they were watching something they weren't supposed to see. Sunny leaned forward. So now you're questioning my intentions? Chris exhaled slowly before answering. I think sometimes public conversations stop being about understanding people and start becoming about cornering them. Joy glanced toward Whoopi again, visibly unsure whether to jump in or stay silent. Even the producers backstage had stopped trying to guide the conversation through headsets because nobody knew how to interrupt without making it worse. Sunny gave a short laugh. That's convenient for celebrities to say when they don't want accountability. The room tightened again. Chris nodded slowly, as if weighing every word carefully now. Accountability matters, he replied. But accountability without fairness becomes performance. That sentence hit the room like a shockwave. A woman in the audience whispered, "Wow," loud enough for nearby microphones to pick it up. Sunny's jaw visibly tightened. You keep using words like performance, she said. You came here to promote a movie. Isn't that a performance too? Chris smiled faintly. Everything on television is performance to some degree. The question is whether it's honest. For a brief second, nobody spoke. Not the hosts. Not the audience. Even the studio crew seemed frozen. And then Sunny crossed a line nobody expected. "You know," she said, looking directly at him, "sometimes attractive male celebrities are given the benefit of appearing calm, while women who push back are labeled aggressive." The audience instantly reacted with a mix of gasps and uncomfortable shifting. Chris blinked once. Not offended, just surprised. Whoopi's eyes widened slightly because even she understood what had just happened. The conversation had stopped being about media and turned personal. Chris answered carefully, "I don't think you're aggressive." Sunny tilted her head. But I think you came into this interview expecting me to play defense." The audience erupted again, louder this time, because he'd said out loud what everyone in the room had slowly started realizing. Sunny's expression hardened immediately. "That's not true." Chris didn't interrupt her. He simply waited, and somehow that calmness made the moment even more intense. Sunny continued, "I ask direct questions to everyone who comes here." "I believe you," Chris answered. But, again, the audience reacted to her repeating his rhythm back at him. Chris looked down briefly before speaking. But there's a difference between asking someone who they are and asking them to defend what people assume they represent. The applause that followed was immediate. Several audience members clapped hard enough that producers backstage started panicking again, worried the crowd was becoming too emotionally involved. Sunny noticed it too, and now frustration was beginning to show openly on her face. "You keep painting yourself as misunderstood," she said. "You're one of the most powerful men in Hollywood." Chris nodded. "I'm fortunate." "Fortunate?" Sunny repeated incredulously. "That's the word you choose?" Chris leaned back slightly. "What word would make you comfortable?" The audience lost it. Gasps exploded across the room. Joy physically covered her mouth, trying not to laugh. Even Whoopi had to look away from the cameras because her expression nearly broke completely. Sunny stared at Chris in disbelief. For the first time all interview, she genuinely seemed thrown off balance. Not because he was yelling, not because he was angry, but because he refused to lose control. And that calmness was becoming impossible to overpower. "You know what?" Sunny said suddenly. "This is exactly what happens with celebrities. The second anyone challenges them, they start reframing the conversation." Chris finally stopped smiling altogether. "No," he said quietly. "What I'm doing is responding to you." That silence afterward felt endless. One camera operator later described the studio atmosphere as feeling electrically charged. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Nobody even shifted in their seats. Chris continued speaking, his voice calm but firmer now. "I came here expecting conversation. I didn't come here expecting hostility disguised as intellectual honesty." The audience exploded. Actual chaos. Applause crashed through the studio so loudly that one producer backstage ripped off their headset in frustration. Sunny immediately jumped in. "Hostility?" "Yes," Chris answered without hesitation. Sunny laughed in disbelief. "You think this is hostile? I think you stopped listening 20 minutes ago." The audience gasped so loudly it nearly drowned out the next sentence. Sunny looked genuinely stunned now. And suddenly the energy at the table changed completely. Because up until this moment, she'd still believed she controlled the interview. Now she realized she didn't. Chris wasn't intimidated. Worse, he was articulate, composed, and impossible to bait into anger. Which meant every sharp moment was landing harder on her instead. Whoopi finally stepped in more firmly. All right, she said, raising her hands slightly. Everybody breathed for a second. The audience laughed nervously. But even Whoopi sounded tense now. Joy jumped in carefully, trying to lighten the mood. I mean, this is definitely more exciting than the interviews where actors only talk about protein shakes. The audience burst into relieved laughter. Even Chris chuckled softly. Sunny didn't. And that's when viewers at home started noticing something else. She looked embarrassed. Not furious. Embarrassed. Because despite all her experience, despite years of controlling difficult interviews, Chris had slowly turned every aggressive moment back around without ever sounding cruel. And audiences were noticing. Social media was already exploding in real time. Clips of Chris calmly saying, "Conversations work better when both sides are listening," were spreading everywhere. Fans online started calling it one of the most uncomfortable moments in The View's history. Back at the table, Sunny tried one final time to regain control. "Let me ask you something directly," she said. "Do you believe women in media are treated unfairly when they challenge powerful men?" Chris answered immediately. Yes. That surprised everyone. Sunny blinked. Chris continued, I absolutely think women face unfair criticism constantly. But I also think assuming disagreement automatically equals oppression is dangerous too. The audience fell silent again, because suddenly the conversation had become deeper than anybody expected. Chris leaned forward slightly. I have daughters, he said quietly. I want them to grow up strong enough to challenge people. But I also want them to grow up believing conversations shouldn't begin with resentment. That line hit the audience emotionally in a completely different way. The tension softened for just a moment. Several people actually nodded. Even Joy's expression changed. But Sunny still looked unconvinced. And as the cameras kept rolling, one thing became painfully clear to everyone watching. This confrontation was far from over. By the time the show returned from commercial break, the energy inside the studio had completely transformed. The audience wasn't buzzing anymore. They were waiting to see whether Sunny Hostin would pull the conversation back under control, or whether Chris Hemsworth would continue dismantling the tension with that unervingly calm confidence. Backstage producers were scrambling. Assistants moved quickly between monitors while social media teams stared at phones flooding with notifications faster than they could respond. Clips from the interview were already spreading online at insane speed. Millions of viewers were debating who was right, who crossed the line first, and whether this had become one of the most uncomfortable celebrity interviews daytime television had seen in years. And the worst part for producers? The numbers were climbing. People were tuning in specifically because of the confrontation. The red studio light flashed. They were live again. Whoopi tried to reset the mood immediately. All right, we're back with Chris Hemsworth, she said carefully, her voice noticeably more measured than before. Things got a little heated before the break. The audience laughed nervously. Chris smiled politely. Sunny didn't. There was still tension written all over her expression, but now there was something else underneath it too. Determination. She wasn't going to let the interview end with her looking defeated. So Chris, she began smoothly, I want to move away from media criticism for a second. Chris nodded. Sure. You've spoken publicly before about wanting privacy for your family. Yes. But at the same time, your family appears in magazine shoots, documentaries, social media campaigns. Chris already knew where she was going. And, he asked calmly. Sunny leaned forward. Some people feel celebrities want control over attention. You want visibility when it benefits your brand and privacy when criticism appears. A few audience members murmured again. Chris stayed relaxed, but this time his eyes narrowed slightly. Not angrily. Carefully. I think every parent tries to protect their family, he answered. But your family is part of your public image, Sunny pushed. Chris nodded once. They're part of my life. That's not the same thing. The audience shifted uneasily. Joy glanced toward Whoopi again like she was silently asking whether someone should interrupt. Nobody did. Chris folded his hands together. You know, he said quietly, this is interesting. Sunny raised an eyebrow. What is? You keep framing human relationships as strategies. The audience reacted instantly. Another wave of applause rolled through the studio. Sunny looked frustrated now. No, she shot back. I'm framing celebrity culture honestly. Chris tilted his head slightly. Do you think audiences stop seeing celebrities as human after a certain level of fame? That question caught her off guard. Even the audience seemed surprised by how sincere it sounded. Sunny paused briefly before answering. No, but I think fame changes accountability. Chris nodded slowly. I agree with that. Sunny looked momentarily relieved to hear agreement. But then Chris continued. What concerns me is when accountability becomes dehumanization. Silence. Again. Every time the conversation seemed ready to cool down, Chris somehow redirected it into something sharper. Something heavier. Sunny crossed her arms again. Nobody's dehumanizing you. Chris looked directly at her. You reduced my family to branding 2 sentences ago. The audience audibly gasped. Sunny immediately opened her mouth to respond, but Chris kept going calmly. And honestly, that's what I think bothers people now. We've become so obsessed with analyzing public figures that we forget there are actual human beings sitting in front of us. The applause this time was overwhelming. Some audience members were clapping before he even finished speaking. One woman near the back shouted, Exactly. Producers backstage looked horrified because audience participation was becoming impossible to control. Sunny's expression tightened again. You're making this very personal. Chris gave a small shrug. It is personal. That answer landed hard. Not dramatic. Not loud. just honest enough to change the entire emotional atmosphere in the room. For the first time since the interview started, Sunny seemed uncertain about how to respond. And viewers watching at home noticed it instantly, because Chris wasn't reacting like celebrities usually reacted under pressure. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't angry. He wasn't trying to escape the conversation. He was confronting it directly, while somehow remaining calmer than everyone else at the table. That contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. Sunny finally spoke again. You know, Chris, some people might say you're very skilled at controlling perception. Chris laughed softly under his breath. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just answering honestly. But honesty can still be calculated. Chris smiled slightly. So can hostility. The audience exploded. Joy nearly fell backward laughing. Whoopi physically covered her face for a second. Even some crew members behind the cameras visibly reacted now. Sunny stared at Chris in disbelief. Because once again, he'd managed to counter her point instantly without raising his voice. And now the audience was fully with him. Social media clips were spreading even faster. So Can Hostility was already trending online before the segment even ended. Sunny took a breath. Then another, trying to regain composure. You seem frustrated with the media, she said carefully. Chris shook his head. No, I'm frustrated with what conversations are becoming. What does that mean? Chris looked out toward the audience for a moment before answering. It means people don't talk to understand anymore. They talk to win. The room fell completely silent. That line hit differently, because suddenly it didn't feel like he was only talking about television anymore. It felt bigger than that. Even Sunny seemed affected by it for a second. Chris continued quietly. And honestly, I think people watching at home can feel that. They can tell when a conversation is real and when two people are trying to corner each other. Sunny's expression changed subtly. For the first time all interview, she looked reflective instead of combative. But the moment didn't last. Do you think you've been cornered today? She asked. Chris looked at her calmly. I think you wanted me to be. Gasps crashed through the audience again. Sunny immediately shook her head. That's not true. Chris nodded gently. Okay. That single word somehow made the tension even worse. Because he didn't argue. He didn't push harder. He just let the silence sit there. And suddenly Sunny looked more uncomfortable than ever. Whoopi stepped in quickly. All right, I think everybody's making points here. But Sunny interrupted her. No, because I want to address this. The audience leaned forward instantly. Sunny turned fully toward Chris now. You keep implying I came into this interview with bad intentions. That's unfair. Chris met her gaze evenly. Then maybe ask yourself why so many people in this room felt the tension before I said anything. The audience absolutely erupted. People clapped. Some gasped. Others looked completely stunned. Joy actually whispered, "Oh my God," under her breath. Sunny's face flushed immediately. And for the first time all morning, she genuinely had no response ready. Chris finally leaned back in his chair again, calm as ever. But now the entire room understood something undeniable. He wasn't surviving the interview anymore. He had taken control of it. There wasn't supposed to be a part 5. That's what made everything that happened afterward feel even more unbelievable. The interview officially ended minutes earlier. The cameras had cut away. The audience applause sign switched off. Producers rushed onto the stage trying to move everyone toward the next scheduled segment. But nobody was focused on the next segment anymore, because the tension hadn't ended when the broadcast stopped. If anything, it had gotten worse. Chris Hemsworth stood from his chair calmly, buttoning his jacket while audience members nearby whispered excitedly to each other. Some were already checking their phones, eyes widening as clips from the interview exploded across social media in real time. Meanwhile, Sunny Hostin remained seated for several extra seconds. Silent, still staring at the table. One producer approached cautiously. You okay? Sunny gave a quick nod, but her expression told a completely different story. Because what had just happened wasn't a normal tense interview anymore. It had become a public shift in momentum, and everyone backstage knew it. Joy Behar walked over first, trying to lighten the mood. Well, she joked awkwardly, that'll definitely trend. A few nervous laughs broke out among crew members. Sunny didn't laugh. Chris noticed immediately, and despite everything that had happened, he walked back toward the table instead of leaving. That surprised everyone, especially Sunny. I don't want this to feel personal, Chris said quietly once he reached her. The room went still again. Even backstage assistants slowed down to listen. Sunny looked up at him, exhausted more than angry now. It became personal an hour ago. Chris nodded slowly. You pushed hard. That's my job. I know, he answered gently. But sometimes it felt like you were arguing with what I represent instead of who I am. That line hit differently off camera. Without the applause. Without the audience reactions. Without the pressure of live television. It sounded honest. Sunny looked away for a second. And for the first time all day, her confidence cracked. You have any idea what it's like sitting in this chair? She asked quietly. Every question gets judged. If you challenge someone too hard, you're cruel. If you go easy, people call you fake. Chris listened carefully. No sarcasm. No comeback ready. Just listening. Sunny continued, frustration finally pouring out. People online already hate me before I even speak sometimes. They decide what I am before the conversation starts. Chris blinked once, because suddenly she'd unknowingly described the exact thing he'd been talking about the entire interview. The irony hung heavily between them, and she realized it almost immediately. The room stayed silent. Then Chris smiled faintly. Yeah, he said softly. I think maybe that's my point. Sunny looked at him for several long seconds, and slowly her expression changed. Not defeated, not angry, just reflective. Behind them, producers were already panicking over social media numbers climbing into the millions. Clips of the confrontation were dominating every platform. Headlines were appearing faster than networks could publish them. Chris Hemsworth silences Sunny Hostin. Most uncomfortable View interview ever? Fans divided after explosive clash. Some headlines praised Chris. Others defended Sunny fiercely. But nearly all of them agreed on one thing. People couldn't stop watching. One assistant rushed over to a producer whispering that multiple entertainment outlets were already requesting statements from both sides. Another producer muttered, "This is going to be everywhere by tonight." And they were right. By evening, the internet had become a war zone. Fans flooded comment sections arguing over who crossed the line first. Some viewers called Chris composed and respectful under pressure. Others accused him of subtly manipulating the audience against Sunny. Meanwhile, clips of Sunny's tougher questions circulated beside viral edits, portraying her as confrontational. Every sentence from the interview became dissected online. Every facial expression became a meme. Every pause became evidence for somebody's argument. But what viewers didn't see was the final moment backstage. The moment after most staff had cleared out. Sunny stood near the edge of the stage gathering her notes when Chris stopped beside her one last time. No hard feelings, he asked. Sunny stared at him for a second before laughing softly under her breath. You really stay this calm all the time? Chris grinned. No, I just learned anger usually gives people exactly what they want. That answer stayed with her. You could see it, because for the first time all day, Sunny genuinely smiled back. Not a television smile. A real one. Well, she admitted quietly, you definitely survived the View. Chris laughed. I don't think survival was the goal. Then he walked off stage. And somehow that final exit felt even more powerful than the confrontation itself. Because he hadn't stormed out. He hadn't insulted anyone. He hadn't tried humiliating her. He'd simply stood his ground calmly enough that the entire room shifted around him. And by the next morning, the fallout had become impossible to ignore. Television analysts debated whether Sunny had gone too far. Body language experts broke down every second of the interview. Reaction channels uploaded hour-long discussions. Some called it a masterclass in composure. Others called it passive-aggressive manipulation disguised as calmness. But regardless of which side viewers chose, everybody watched. And somewhere inside that chaos, one uncomfortable truth lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. Sometimes the loudest person in the room isn't the one who wins. Sometimes it's the person calm enough to let everyone else reveal themselves first. So what do you think? Did Chris Hemsworth handle the pressure with class? Or did Sunny Hostin have every right to challenge him the way she did? Drop your opinion in the comments below, because this conversation is far from over. And don't forget to subscribe to the Echo View for more explosive celebrity confrontations, shocking interviews, and dramatic stories straight from the world of daytime television.